detect injury risk. It helps to identify talents. The goal is always to win the game, so performance at the highest level. Hello, welcome to this online course module on sport-specific testing. My name is Bastian Haber. I'm a sports physiotherapist working as head of physiotherapy at FC Jazz. And today we'll explore what sport-specific testing is, why it matters, what to test, when to test, and how to navigate limiting factors like budget, time, and technology. So let's move on. What is sport-specific testing? Well, sport-specific testing refers to an assessment of physical qualities and movement patterns that are relevant. And this is really important. It has to be relevant to the demands of a specific sport. That's why we call it sport-specific testing. It focuses on collecting objective data that reflects athletic performance. So we're not just testing anything, we need to be specific. And how are we specific is in terms of biomechanics of a sport and demands of a sport. And all of this is performance driven. Now you would think, how does this sport-specific testing differ from normal fitness testing? Well, there is a difference. If we think about fitness testing in general, it's often more in a picture of finding if a person is fit or if a person is not fit. You have certain parameters, obviously, that you test, like endurance, maybe strength, okay? But it's more general. So this is more than just defining or determining if an athlete is fit or not. It's more about understanding how are they fit, and how are these attributes that the athlete presents can translate to performance and success within that specific sport. So why does this matter? Why does sport-specific testing matter in a high-performance environment? Sport-specific testing offers an insight into physical capacities that influence match performance. And within this high-performance environment, such as sport and football, as an example here, the goal is always to win the game. So performance at the highest level. Therefore, getting insight into these physical capacities allows us to get a better control of it and therefore influence match performance. So it matters also in the fact that it supports our evidence-based decision making. So it is not just decision making of guessing, wild guessing. It is actually evidence-based and based on this data that we can collect from sport-specific testing. And this especially helps us in load management. And it also helps us to track improvements, for example, in strength and conditioning. So let's say we are planning a certain type of programming throughout the year. Testing allows us to see where we are. Does the athlete respond actually to the training and the program that we have given them, and how can we adjust? And therefore, testing in high performance environments, it matters. It matters actually a lot. It takes a big role of how we manage the team. So let's move on to the next section. In this section, we are talking about why do we test? What are the benefits? What are the downsides? And what are the key uses of the data? So let's begin with the benefits. Testing gives us measurable and repeatable data. It highlights individual needs for more tailored programming, as we said already. And this programming is not only in performance programming, but also it helps us in rehabilitation. Repeated testing shows training effects. If we are programming a certain type of performance training, such as strength and conditioning, especially in repeated testing, which means like more frequent testing, we can see the effects of this. And according to the effects and the outcomes of this testing, we can adjust our programming. Then if we dive in the world of youth athletes, if we start testing youth athletes at a consistent timing and consistent level, it allows us to long-term monitoring across growth, maturity, and we can assess biomechanics early on. And throughout all age groups and professional levels in this segment, we can detect early injury risk through testing. Or we can also detect underdevelopment. Both are possible. So what would be the downsides? The downsides are that data or purely connecting data without context is basically useless. So You always have to collect this data within a context in order for it to be meaningful. It must be interpreted alongside positional demands, fatigue levels, and testing conditions. That's very important. And another factor that can be a downside is factors like sleep quality, soreness, and motivation of a player. And these come into play especially during in-season testing. And then another downside that maybe is not really thought of, but in my opinion, testing can be labeling. So for example, if a player is performing not well at a test, he might be labeled as slow or weak. So you have to be aware of this in order to not bring up labeling in such a manner, because that would affect the player negatively throughout the season and might affect also him playing or not playing. And then what would be the key uses of the data? As said already, with the data that we collected, we can program more detailed and more individually. And that means also for rehabilitation. And let's think about a player that comes back after hamstring injury, returns to running or jogging. Often what I use is a mass test, and because the player is not running at its 100% sprint, he's running at the mass speed. And when you're using, for example, mass times, you can use them as a reference to see where the player is and what kind of speed that he actually run in the rehab process. Another thing, of course, as we said already, it helps us detect injury risk, and also it helps to identify talents within the youth segment. In the next section we are talking about what to be tested. You can see in the slide there's this flow chart, and what you could do is you think about a sport and you think about a test, and then you just try to guide yourself through this flow chart, and it may help you understand the process of choosing a test. Take a couple minutes for that. We are going to continue about why not every test is valuable, for example. So sport-specific tests, they should be reflecting real sports demands. They must be measurable and repeatable. And they must provide something meaningful, like some meaningful information to improve your training. For football, for example, this includes sprint speed, deceleration, change of direction, agility, strength, power, endurance, and reactive strength. Now I want to show you what kind of tests we have performed in pre-season and season. Let's start with the speed and acceleration. We have tested speed and acceleration with the sprinting tests. The equipment that was available were two lasers. So we used it at a 10-meter mark and a 30-meter mark. And we performed it in one test, so to say. So it was basically one sprint, and we had the one laser at 10 meters and one laser at 30 meters. 10 meters is a good mark for acceleration, and 30 meters is where most players or individual hit their high speed and top speed. That's why we set these markers. Why it matters, obviously speed is crucial in football. First step quickness, as for acceleration, is important to winning balls, overcoming the opponents, chasing down balls and such things. Then we have been testing explosive power with a counter movement jump. Unfortunately, we did not have force plates because they just give the most insight. But we were fortunate to have like a laser test that sits on the ground. So we got like very accurate jumping heights. Why this is important? It obviously reflects the characteristics or the skill to win like head balls, which is important in football, as we know. And it is important for defenders as it is for strikers. Another thing why it's important is sprints are explosive. Almost all the movements are explosive in the beginning, or lots of them. So therefore this explosive power is very crucial in football. Then we move on to strength tests. What we did there, we did various like maximum strength tests, such as push-ups, pull-ups, back extension holds, so isometrics. and reverse lunges. This is important for shielding the ball from opponents, especially under pressure. Obviously, physical contact and winning physical fights is important. And also this is one of the important factors for reducing the risk of injury. And then lastly, we tested endurance capacity with a maximal aerobic speed test, MAS. And our setup was that we had 4 cones, one at a 0 mark, the start line, 20 meters, 40 meters and 60 meters. And the guys were instructed to run 0 to 20 and back, 0 to 40 and back, and 0 to 60 and back. And this for 5 loops. So it was altogether a distance of 1,200 meters. And this gives us good insight into their aerobic capacity at this like mass speed. So it is not 100% speed, but it's this maximum aerobic speed. Why is this important? Well, football is all about running. So the guys have to run. Players cover over 10 kilometers per game if they play 90 minutes. So even though I think this section this section is mostly disliked by most individuals who are playing football, but it is actually the most important, because a good base endurance and a good aerobic and anaerobic capacity allows you to be more focused throughout the whole game, and also just being able to play the whole game and still pulling sprints at like over 90 minutes and being able to run and run and run. Now you might think why we are only choosing these 4 tests. There's many factors influencing that. We will come back to these later, but for now I can only say for us these were the most relevant, that we were able to perform within a certain amount of time and also with the budget that was available. So let's move on to the next section. In this section we are going to talk about how do we interpret the data, what does it tell us, and how can we connect it to movement. So if we look behind the numbers that we collect from our tests, we can find neuromuscular profiles, we can detect limb asymmetries, we can see if a player is speed or force dominant, and we can also see if someone prefers, or some individual has a energy system preference, and also we can detect and profile movement strategies. Now if we are connecting these collected data to real movement, and how do we connect it to movement, it is better to explain this type of thinking and this logic at the hand of a concrete example. So we're taking the counter movement jump as an example. Let's connect the quality of a test parameter to a quality of movement. So let's think about the time to take off. It would reflect the speed of force development. Then we compare eccentric versus concentric force. It will give us information about movement strategies. The initial impulse will show us the total energy output of a player. Asymmetries, for example in force plates we can see asymmetries right left side. It would reveal dominance or compensation. And if we take the flight contact time ratio, it would tell us or indicate things about efficiency and stiffness. Further on, we could think also, if a player presents, for example, high concentric impulse, we could assume that the player has a good acceleration power. Another example would be a low jump height, but a high peak force could potentially tell us that the athlete needs more power and speed conversion skill type of training and not more strength training. If we think about the tests like the 10 and 30 meter sprints, the 10 meter sprints, as said earlier already, it will tell us more about acceleration. The 30 meter sprint times will tell us more about top speed. Drop jumps, for example, tell us more about reactive strength, which would in theory translate to more cutting and agility type of movements. Let's move on to the next section. In this section we are still talking about interpreting and connecting the data, and this time we are discussing this at the hand of real examples. So I have taken test results from our pre-season testing of two players. One player is a central attacking midfielder and the other one is a striker. That's all I'm going to say now about them. Let's compare counter movement jumps. As you can see, counter movement jumps are nearly similar, which both suggest very explosive vertical power. So good neuromuscular control and efficiency in both players. If we move on to the 10 and 30 meter sprint times, we can see that player 2 is clearly faster, especially in the second measurement, which is the top speed measurement. This would suggest us that the player 2 has a higher horizontal force production. And this aligns, of course, also if you think about positional demands as a striker with these characteristics. So higher top end speed is more favorable for a striker. If we are connecting both, despite the very similar counter movement jump measures, the sprint values suggest that player 2 has a more efficient force production and orientation, possibly also presents a higher relative power and a higher rate of force development. If we look at the mass test, player 2 again is presenting a faster time, which would or could reflect at a higher overall conditioning. So despite the almost identical jumping heights in the counter movement jump, the difference in sprint times and mass show very unique performance profiles, right? So this highlights why our multi-metric testing allows for deeper insight into the performance, and it shows that not all the power is applied equally. And now, if we are putting these numbers, the data, together with player positioning and individual picturing of the player and appearance, so to say, I have now the whole picture, right? So player 1, central attacking midfielder, I have the data, I know the guy personally, I know his motivation, I know the way he moves, I know all about him. I know player 2 as well, I know all the data, I know the way he moves, I know his motivation, I know his stature, I know his size. And putting this all together, it makes sense that the striker is playing a striker and the central attacking midfielder is playing a central attacking midfielder. And if you would solely look at the numbers, you might think, okay, maybe different power, same size, maybe even, because all the numbers are not too far apart still, right? They are still somewhat in a close range. But knowing the players, I can tell you that they are very, very different in appearance. Central attacking midfielder is a Northern European guy, heritage Finland. He's very motivated, he never gives up, he's really strong mentally, physically also really strong, explosive, super explosive, technically really strong guy. Our striker is foreign heritage. He comes from Africa. That maybe describes why he is so fast at the sprinting times due to genetical factors, but this is just a guessing. He has a different kind of motivation. If you draw this whole picture and you connect it to the numbers make much more sense. And therefore you cannot say, okay, player 1 central attacking midfielder is 10 seconds slower in mass test. That's not good, that's a bad time. You cannot say that per se, because in a real life match, or not real life, but in a match situation, both players go up to their full potential, and they are both top of the league position players. Why I'm telling you this? I'm telling you this so you're thinking beyond the numbers. You always have to see the whole picture, and you have to see the person behind it. It's really, really important, because there are so many factors influencing performance besides these testing numbers. These testing numbers are just additions to what we already know, and it helps us understand more the side of like load management and training. But it does neglect the other side of personality, motivation, and all these factors. I hope this has helped you to better understand these connections between data and real life. Let's move on to the next section. In this section we are talking about the timing of testing. So when should or do we test? This is also very individual to your environment and to the factors influencing testing. What is the budget, what is the availability, and so on. Generally, you would be testing in pre-season and in-season. In pre-season, it is important to not test too early after off-season. You need to give a certain amount of time for the players and individuals to kind of re-acclimate. So like re-establish this baseline that allows you for maximum testing. That's really important. And the goals of the pre-season testing would be to establish this baseline and guide the programming of the pre-season to prepare for in-season demands especially. And also detect risks. So possible risks of injury, of undertraining and so on. If we move on to the in-season testing, it becomes crucial to be mindful about the timing, because in-season you're dealing a lot with load management, lots of game. You are more focused on recovery and maintenance and injury reduction. So testing at maximum level becomes not easy, and finding the right time is also very difficult. And when you're interpreting the data and the numbers from the in-season testing, you need to be more mindful about things like fatigue, soreness and motivation and all these things, because the player is in the situation of a season where there's important games, maybe 2 or 3 games even per week we are talking here. So testing is a thing that in the preseason players usually enjoy a lot, but in season is more disliked due to the factor of fatigue, for example. Let's move on to the next section. In this section we are talking about the constraints and limiting factors of testing. We've mentioned throughout this presentation already a couple, but common restricting factors are time constraints. So for example, limited testing windows or times due to like tight season schedules or training schedules. Another limiting factor can be staff. Testing as one person is nearly impossible, because you need to write the data down, you need to be able to see that it's performed at the right manner. So you always need like 2 or 3 people. And the lack of qualified testers is also a limiting factor. I think one of the most obvious limiting factors is maybe budget. If you don't have access to somewhat of an equipment, testing becomes very difficult. Space, you need space that is like consistent and maybe somewhat protected from outdoors weather conditions is good. So the best would be maybe an inside hall where you can test. Another thing is player buy-in, so motivation to test. Why do we test? How do we make them perform at 100% in these tests? Another thing, for example, coach integration. How do we get the coach to buy into the testing? Just the same as the players, but player buy-in and coach buy-in goes more with education. So you have to educate, why are we doing this? What are the benefits of this? And another thing, sort of not a limiting factor, but it could be more like a negative thing, is like the data overload. And too much data without the clear interpretation or follow-up action can just create confusion and is sort of a waste of time. So maybe to keep in mind is test what you can act on. So test what you can improve if there needs to be improvement. And also you don't need high technology. I think it's more important to be like clear and consistent with your tests. That way you can assure like high quality testing. So what would be like high tech technology for testing? We're talking about force plates, GPS, Nordboard and so on. There's like hundreds of different devices, jumping mats, video analysis and so on. But there's also low-tech solutions. Stopwatch and cones, it's enough for a mass test. Chalk, so the white stuff that you can draw on, as it was back in the day in the schools before there were the whiteboards. That, for example, you can do an easy jumping height test. It's maybe not as accurate, but it still gives you numbers, and if you collect these numbers over a certain amount of time, so you can still see improvements or decline in performance. And nowadays with apps, we have very good apps that can measure already counter movement jumps and such things at a quite low price. And just keep in mind, consistency stands over complexity. So consistency gives you more availability to the data and how you interpret it, rather than being total like complicated with high technology that maybe takes lots of time and money and all these kind of things. Yes, and then let's move on to the next section. So this is the final section of this module. I hope you have understood now why we are testing and how we test and what is important, and basically got a baseline and a fundament for testing. This is not meant to be instruction for like detailed testing. It's more so information-based module that will drive you to understand the basics for this topic, and also to create and start creating your own tests if you can. Or for example, let's think you're going to a practice, you go to a sports environment, you will understand the testing and you will be able to support the testing, for example. Now, as this is football specific, why does all this matter in football? There is studies on that support sports specific testing in football, and it shows us that it allows for position specific insights. If you think about the comparison of the central attacking midfielder to the striker, so for example that strikers have a higher sprint speed. It informs us about load management, which is really important, especially during in-season. We can identify talents in the youth section. And with the rehabilitation, we have a better return to play integration, because we can compare results to the healthy state of the player or the non-injured state of the player. And as shown earlier by our own player data of the preseason tests, there are clear patterns, right, between test results and role demands. The final thoughts are that testing is valuable if it's used with a purpose. So we have to combine physical test results, sport demands, and player traits. And we can use it to guide training, load management, and rehabilitation. Thank you all for listening. In the last slide, there is the references that you can read and use, and I suggest you to go through these. There's a couple of really good articles that go much more detailed into the topic if you're interested and have to do that. As I said earlier, this was a good overview and will give you a really good fundament to build your house of testing knowledge. So, thank you very much, enjoy, and see you soon.